The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time. At 28, he had served in the Queen's Guard for 5 years, and the routine had become second nature. Stand perfectly still, eyes forward, no movement, no expression, no interaction with the public, no matter what they said or did. James took his position outside the castle gates at exactly 6 a.m., his bearskin hat adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. Tourists were already gathering, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards who never moved, never spoke, never acknowledged their existence. The rules were carved in stone, passed down through generations of guardsmen. They were not entertainers. They were soldiers with a sacred duty to protect the royal family. Any deviation from protocol could result in disciplinary action, demotion, or even dismissal from the prestigious unit. As the morning progressed, James watched the familiar parade of visitors from the corner of his eye. Families posed for photos, children waved enthusiastically, and tourists tried every trick in the book to get a reaction. Some made funny faces, others told jokes loudly, and a few even attempted to touch the guards' uniforms. James remained stone-faced through it all. Around 10 a.m., a different group caught his attention. A family of 4 approached slowly, not rushing, like the typical tourists. The father pushed a wheelchair containing a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The child was painfully thin, his head covered by a colorful knit cap that couldn't quite hide the fact that he had lost his hair. Even from his rigid position, James could see the telltale signs of chemotherapy treatment. The mother walked beside them, her hand resting gently on her son's shoulder. An older girl, perhaps 10 or 11, stayed close to the wheelchair, occasionally leaning down to whisper something to her younger brother. There was something different about this family's energy. While other tourists approached with excitement and curiosity, this group moved with a quiet reverence, as if they understood the weight of tradition they were witnessing. The little boy stared up at James with wide, curious eyes. Unlike the other children who had passed by that morning, he didn't wave or make faces. He simply watched, studying every detail of the uniform, the ceremony, the discipline. There was an old soul quality to his gaze, a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. James had seen many sick children during his time on duty. Families often brought terminally ill relatives to see the changing of the guard, hoping to create one last beautiful memory. The sight always affected him, but he had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to maintain his professional demeanor no matter what personal feelings stirred within him. But something about this particular boy was different. Perhaps it was the way he sat so still in his wheelchair, mirroring James's own rigid posture. Or maybe it was the quiet dignity he displayed, never asking for special attention or accommodation. The child seemed to understand instinctively that he was witnessing something sacred, something bigger than himself. The father positioned the wheelchair directly in front of James, about 10 feet away. The family spoke in hushed tones, clearly American tourists who had traveled far for this moment. James could catch fragments of their conversation as they discussed the history of the guard, the significance of the ceremony, and the discipline required to stand motionless for hours at a time. "Look at how still he is, Tommy," the mother said softly to her son. "He's been standing there without moving for hours. It takes incredible strength and dedication." The boy nodded seriously, his eyes never leaving James's face. "Does it hurt to stand so still, Mama?" he whispered. "I imagine it does, sweetheart. But he does it anyway because it's important. Some things are worth doing even when they're difficult." James felt a tightness in his chest at the mother's words. He recognized the deeper meaning behind them, the life lesson she was trying to impart to her son who was fighting his own difficult battle. The parallel wasn't lost on him. Both he and this small boy were demonstrating courage in the face of adversity, standing strong even when it was painful. As the minutes ticked by, James found himself acutely aware of the boy's presence. Other tourists came and went, taking their photos and moving on to the next attraction. But Tommy and his family remained, content to simply observe and absorb the moment. The child's steady gaze never wavered, and James began to feel a strange connection forming across the invisible barrier that separated them. In all his years of service, James had never felt such a pull to break protocol. The boy wasn't asking for anything, wasn't demanding attention or trying to get a reaction. He was simply there, bearing witness to James's duty with the same quiet strength he was likely showing in his own fight against cancer. The morning sun climbed higher, and James could feel sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform. His legs ached from standing motionless, and his neck was beginning to cramp from holding his head in the prescribed position. But every time he felt the urge to shift or adjust, he would catch sight of Tommy in his peripheral vision, sitting just as still, just as determined, facing his own much greater challenge with grace and courage. By 11 a.m., James realized that this would not be just another routine day of guard duty. Something was shifting inside him, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, tradition, and what it truly meant to serve. The crowd around the castle gates began to thin as lunchtime approached, but Tommy's family showed no signs of leaving. The little boy had been sitting in his wheelchair for over an hour now, his eyes fixed on James with unwavering attention. His parents occasionally offered him water or adjusted his position, but Tommy seemed completely absorbed in watching the guard perform his duty. James noticed that other tourists were beginning to take notice of the boy as well. Several people had approached the family to ask questions, clearly curious about why they were staying so long. He watched as the father patiently explained that his son was fascinated by the ceremony and tradition, though James suspected there was more to the story than what was being shared with strangers. Around 11:30, James observed a subtle change in Tommy's condition. The boy's head began to droop slightly, and his mother immediately moved to his side, checking his temperature with the back of her hand. She whispered something to her husband, who nodded with concern. They were clearly debating whether to stay or return to their hotel. But Tommy straightened up with visible effort, shaking his head firmly when his parents suggested they leave. "Not yet, Papa," James heard him say in a small but determined voice. "I want to see him finish his watch. He's been standing there for so long, just like I have to sit still during treatments. I want to see him complete it." The words hit James like a physical blow. This brave little boy was drawing strength from watching him stand at his post, seeing their shared endurance as a connection that transcended their different circumstances. The weight of that responsibility settled on James's shoulders like a mantle heavier than any uniform he had ever worn. As the clock tower chimed noon, James knew his relief would arrive within the hour. The changing of the guard ceremony would begin soon, and protocol demanded that he remain focused on his duties. But he found his thoughts increasingly drawn to the small figure in the wheelchair, who continued to watch him with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail. Tommy's sister had grown restless and was asking to visit the gift shop, but the boy refused to leave his position. "I promised him I'd watch him finish," he said seriously, as if James could hear him and was depending on his presence. The innocence and sincerity of the statement made James's throat tighten with emotion. The mother knelt beside the wheelchair and spoke quietly to her son. "Tommy, sweetheart, the guard doesn't know we're here. He can't see us or hear us. That's part of his job." But Tommy shook his head with the certainty that only children possess. "He knows, Mama. I can tell. We're helping each other be strong. He's showing me how to stand still even when it's hard, and I'm showing him that someone cares about what he's doing." James felt a profound shift in his understanding of his role. For 5 years, he had viewed his duty as a solitary act of service, a personal demonstration of discipline and loyalty. But this 7-year-old boy was teaching him that his service had a different dimension entirely. He wasn't just guarding a building or maintaining a tradition. He was providing an example of strength and perseverance to anyone who needed to see it. The wind picked up, causing James's plume to flutter slightly. It was the only movement he allowed himself, but it seemed to delight Tommy, who pointed it out excitedly to his family. Such a small thing, but in the boy's world of limited mobility and constant medical procedures, even the sight of a feather dancing in the breeze had become a source of joy. At 12:30, James heard the familiar sound of boots on cobblestone that signaled the approach of his relief. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and tourists started gathering in greater numbers anticipating the spectacle. Tommy's family was pushed further back by the crowd, but the boy craned his neck to maintain visual contact with James. During the brief moments when protocol allowed him to shift his gaze, James tried to locate Tommy in the sea of faces. When their eyes met across the crowded courtyard, he saw something that made his heart race. The boy raised his small hand in a tiny, discreet wave, a gesture meant only for him. It was barely perceptible to anyone else, but to James, it felt like a thunderbolt. In that instant, James made a decision that would change everything. The rigid walls of military protocol that had governed his life for 5 years began to crack, not from weakness or rebellion, but from a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. Sometimes, he realized, the most important duty was not to the institution, but to the individual human soul that needed to witness compassion and connection. The ceremony began with its usual precision and pageantry. The incoming guard marched in perfect formation, their red tunics brilliant in the afternoon sun. The crowd pressed forward, cameras clicking, everyone eager to capture the famous British tradition in action. But James was no longer thinking about tradition in the abstract sense. He was thinking about a 7-year-old boy who had taught him that true strength wasn't just about standing rigid and unmovable. Sometimes it was about knowing when to bend, when to show humanity, when to acknowledge that connection between people mattered more than any rule ever written. As the ceremony progressed toward its conclusion, James began to plan something that had never occurred to him in 5 years of service. He was going to break protocol, not out of disrespect for his position, but out of a deeper respect for what his position could mean to someone who desperately needed to see that the world still contained kindness and recognition of human dignity. The changing of the guard was almost complete, and in a few moments James would be officially relieved of his duty. What happened next would either be the most meaningful moment of his military career or the end of it entirely. But as he caught another glimpse of Tommy's upturned face in the crowd, James knew he had already made his choice. The moment of transition arrived with military precision. James heard his sergeant's voice calling out the traditional commands that would officially end his watch. In less than 60 seconds, he would step away from his post and march back to the guardhouse, his duty completed according to centuries of unbroken protocol. But as he prepared for the final moments of his shift, James's eyes found Tommy once more in the crowd. The little boy had been pushed even further back by the surge of tourists, but he was straining in his wheelchair, trying to see over the adults who blocked his view. His father was holding him steady while his mother attempted to create a clear line of sight for her son. The frustration on Tommy's face was evident. After waiting patiently for hours to see the conclusion of James's watch, he was being denied the moment he had anticipated most. Other tourists, unaware of the boy's special interest in the ceremony, continued to jostle for better positions, inadvertently blocking his view completely. James watched as Tommy's mother tried to politely ask people to move aside so her son could see. But in the excitement of the ceremony, few people paid attention to her quiet requests. The boy's disappointment was written across his thin features, and James could see him fighting back tears of frustration. The sergeant called out the final command. James was officially relieved of his post. According to protocol, he should execute a perfect about-face, fall into formation with his fellow guards, and march away without acknowledging the crowd. It was a routine he had performed hundreds of times without deviation. Instead, James remained perfectly still. His replacement had taken the position. The ceremony was technically complete, but James stood frozen in place, weighing the consequences of what he was about to do. 5 years of impeccable service, commendations for duty and discipline, the respect of his superiors and peers, all of it could disappear in the next 30 seconds. But then he looked at Tommy again, saw the boy's shoulders sagging with disappointment, and James realized that some things mattered more than career advancement or perfect service records. Sometimes the most important mission wasn't the one outlined in the duty manual. Sometimes it was the one written in the heart of a 7-year-old child who had taught him about true courage. James began to move, but not in the direction protocol demanded. Instead of turning toward the guardhouse, he stepped forward, directly toward the crowd. The murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered tourists as they realized something unprecedented was happening. His fellow guards exchanged shocked glances. The sergeant's eyes widened in disbelief. This was not just a breach of protocol. It was something that simply didn't happen. Queen's guards didn't break character. They didn't interact with the public. They certainly didn't abandon their formation to walk into a crowd of tourists. But James continued forward with the same measured precision he brought to every military maneuver. The crowd parted before him, people stepping aside in stunned silence. Camera phones appeared everywhere, capturing what they sensed was a historic moment, though none of them understood its true significance. James moved through the crowd with singular purpose, his tall frame and distinctive uniform making his progress unmistakable. Tourists pressed back against each other, creating a narrow corridor through which he passed. The whispers followed in his wake, speculation about what could possibly cause a Queen's Guard to abandon protocol so dramatically. As he drew closer to Tommy's location, James could see the boy's eyes growing wider with each step. Tommy sat, straighter in his wheelchair, his previous disappointment replaced by wonder and disbelief. His parents looked equally stunned, glancing at each other as they tried to process what was happening. When James reached the family, he stopped precisely, 3 feet from Tommy's wheelchair and executed a perfect military salute. The crowd fell completely silent, hundreds of people holding their breath as they witnessed something that had never happened before in the long history of the Queen's Guard. Tommy's face transformed with pure joy and amazement. His small hand rose shakily to return the salute, though his technique was far from military standard. The gesture was perfect in its imperfection, the salute of a brave little soldier acknowledging a fellow warrior. James held his salute for exactly 10 seconds, the same duration required when saluting a superior officer. To him, this child who faced each day with courage and grace deserved nothing less than the respect accorded to the highest-ranking official. When James finally lowered his hand, he did something even more unprecedented. He removed his bearskin hat, the towering symbol of his position and authority, and placed it gently on Tommy's head. The enormous hat completely dwarfed the small boy, but Tommy wore it like a crown, his smile radiant with pride and wonder. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. People were crying, cheering, taking pictures, and calling out words of approval. But James heard none of it. His entire focus was on the 7-year-old boy who was looking up at him with an expression of pure happiness and gratitude. Tommy reached out with one small hand and placed it on James's arm. "Thank you for sharing your strength with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd's noise. "I'll remember this forever." James knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. For the first time in 5 years of service, he spoke while in uniform, his voice steady and warm. "And I'll remember your strength, soldier. You've shown me what real courage looks like." He gently lifted the bearskin hat from Tommy's head and placed it back on his own. Then, with the same precision that had marked every moment of his military service, James stood and saluted Tommy one final time. As he turned to rejoin his unit, James knew that regardless of what disciplinary action awaited him, he had just completed the most important duty of his entire military career. He had served not just his country or his queen, but a small boy who had taught him that sometimes the most powerful act of service was simply recognizing another person's humanity and worth. The walk back to the guardhouse felt like the longest march of James's military career. Behind him, the crowd continued to buzz with excitement over what they had witnessed, but ahead of him waited the inevitable consequences of his unprecedented breach of protocol. Every step brought him closer to what would likely be the end of his time with the Queen's Guard. His fellow guardsmen maintained their formation, but James could feel the tension radiating from their rigid postures. In 5 years of service together, none of them had ever seen anything like what had just occurred. Some might understand his motivation, but all of them knew the gravity of what breaking such fundamental protocol meant for their unit's reputation and discipline. Sergeant Major Williams was waiting in the guardhouse courtyard, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. At 55, Williams had served in the Queen's Guard for over 3 decades, and in all that time, he had never witnessed such a flagrant violation of the sacred trust placed in every guardsman. His weathered features showed the strain of trying to process how one of his most reliable soldiers had just shattered centuries of unwavering tradition. Guardsman Mitchell. Williams's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. You will remain at attention until I decide what to do with you. The rest of you dismissed to quarters. As his fellow guards filed past him into the building, James caught glimpses of their expressions. Some looked sympathetic. Others appeared shocked, and a few seemed genuinely angry that his actions had brought scrutiny and potential disgrace upon their entire unit. James understood their reactions completely. He had violated the code they all lived by, the discipline that bound them together as brothers in service. Standing alone in the courtyard with Sergeant Major Williams, James felt the full weight of his decision settling upon him. The euphoria of connecting with Tommy was fading, replaced by the stark reality of military justice. He had knowingly broken protocol, not in a moment of weakness or confusion, but as a deliberate choice. There would be no excuse that could mitigate the severity of his actions. Williams circled him slowly, his boots clicking against the stone pavement with measured precision. In 32 years of service, Mitchell, I have never seen such a blatant disregard for everything we stand for. You abandoned your post. You broke character. You interacted with civilians. You made a spectacle of the uniform and everything it represents. James remained at attention, eyes forward, accepting each word of the rebuke without flinching. Everything the sergeant major said was absolutely true. He had violated every principle of guard duty, and there was no defense for his actions that would satisfy military protocol. Do you have anything to say for yourself, guardsman? Williams demanded, stopping directly in front of him. For a long moment, James considered his response. He could apologize, express regret, attempt to minimize his actions. But as he thought about Tommy's face when he had placed the bearskin hat on his small head, James realized he felt no regret at all. What he had done was right, regardless of the consequences. No excuse, Sergeant Major, James replied firmly. I take full responsibility for my actions. Williams studied him intently, searching for any sign of remorse or attempt at justification. What he saw instead was something that both frustrated and intrigued him, a soldier who had acted with complete conviction and was prepared to accept whatever punishment followed. You realize this will likely end your career with the Guard, Williams said, his voice slightly softer but no less serious. 5 years of exemplary service wiped away in 30 seconds of madness. I understand, Sergeant Major. What Williams didn't immediately share was that his phone had been ringing constantly for the past hour. The incident had been captured on dozens of cameras and was already spreading across social media platforms around the world. News outlets were calling, seeking comment on the heartwarming breach of protocol and the touching moment between guard and cancer patient. The story was being framed not as a disciplinary failure, but as an act of compassion that had captured the public's imagination. Videos of James saluting Tommy and placing his hat on the boy's head were being shared thousands of times, accompanied by comments praising the guard's humanity and the touching nature of the interaction. But public sentiment, however positive, could not override military discipline. The Queen's Guard operated on principles that had remained unchanged for centuries, precisely because any deviation, no matter how well-intentioned, threatened the integrity of the institution. If one guard could break protocol because he felt emotionally moved, what would prevent others from making similar choices based on their personal feelings? Williams had already received calls from his superiors, and the word from above was clear. An example had to be made. The incident could not be allowed to set a precedent that would undermine the discipline and reliability that made the Queen's Guard respected worldwide. Yet as Williams looked at James standing at perfect attention, accepting responsibility without excuse or complaint, he found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. This was not a soldier who had acted out of disrespect or rebellion. This was a man who had seen a sick child and chosen compassion over protocol, knowing full well the price he would pay. The press is calling you a hero, Mitchell, Williams said finally. They're saying you showed the human face of the monarchy, that you demonstrated the compassion and caring that the royal family represents. Social media is exploding with praise for your actions. James remained silent, unsure how to respond to this unexpected information. But here's what the press doesn't understand, Williams continued, his voice hardening again. Heroes in the military follow orders. Heroes maintain discipline. Heroes don't abandon their duties no matter how touching the circumstances might be. The sergeant major paused, studying James's face for any reaction. You put me in an impossible position, Mitchell. I have a soldier who acted with clear compassion and good intentions, whose actions have brought positive attention to the Guard from around the world. But I also have a soldier who violated every rule we live by and set a precedent that could destroy the very foundation of our service. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the courtyard, James realized that the next few minutes would determine not just his own future, but possibly the future of how the Queen's Guard balanced tradition with humanity. His simple act of kindness toward a sick child had become something much larger, a moment that would be remembered and debated long after the disciplinary action was complete. The call came at precisely 4:30 p.m., interrupting what had already been the most unusual day in Sergeant Major Williams' 3 decades of service. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the entire household division, and his tone carried the weight of authority that made even seasoned sergeants stand at attention. Williams, I need you and Guardsman Mitchell in my office immediately. Colonel Harrison's voice was crisp and businesslike. This situation has escalated beyond our normal disciplinary procedures. As they made the short journey to the colonel's office, Williams briefed James on what to expect. The colonel was known for his strict adherence to protocol and his unwavering commitment to maintaining the reputation of the Guard. If anyone would ensure that proper discipline was maintained, it would be Colonel Harrison. But what neither of them knew was that Colonel Harrison had spent the last 2 hours fielding calls from sources far above his normal chain of command. The video of James's interaction with Tommy had not just gone viral on social media, it had reached the highest levels of the royal household itself. The colonel's office was a shrine to military tradition, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished officers and display cases filled with historical artifacts. Behind his massive oak desk sat Colonel Harrison, a man whose ramrod posture and steely gaze had intimidated countless soldiers over his distinguished career. Guardsman Mitchell, the colonel began without preamble. In 40 years of military service, I have never encountered a situation quite like this one. You have managed to simultaneously violate every protocol we hold sacred, while generating more positive publicity for the Queen's Guard than we've received in the past decade combined. James maintained his position at attention, unsure whether this was the beginning of his court-martial or something else entirely. Sir, I take full responsibility for my breach of protocol, James stated clearly. I understand the gravity of my actions and accept whatever consequences are deemed appropriate. Colonel Harrison studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He smiled slightly. Mitchell, do you know who called me an hour ago? No, sir. The private secretary to Her Majesty the Queen. The colonel let this information sink in before continuing. It seems that a certain video has made its way to Buckingham Palace, and the reaction there has been interesting. James felt his stomach drop. If the royal household was involved, this situation had escalated far beyond anything he had imagined. He had not just broken military protocol, he had potentially embarrassed the monarchy itself. But Colonel Harrison's next words defied all of James's expectations. The message I received was quite specific, Mitchell. Her Majesty was shown the video of your interaction with the young cancer patient. She was particularly moved by the dignity and compassion you displayed, and by the clear joy your gesture brought to a child facing such difficult circumstances. The colonel stood and walked around his desk, stopping directly in front of James. The Queen's message was clear. While protocol exists for important reasons, there are moments when the human heart must be allowed to guide our actions. She believes your behavior exemplified the very best qualities of service and compassion that the monarchy seeks to represent. James felt dizzy with relief and confusion. This was not at all what he had expected to hear. However, the colonel continued, his tone becoming more serious. We still have the matter of military discipline to address. You cannot simply ignore protocol without consequences. regardless of the positive outcome. Sergeant Major Williams stepped forward. "Sir, if I may, Guardsman Mitchell has been exemplary in every aspect of his service prior to this incident. His record is spotless and his dedication to duty has been unwavering. I'm aware of his record, Sergeant Major, which is precisely why this situation is so complex." Colonel Harrison returned to his seat and picked up a folder from his desk. "I've spent considerable time today consulting with my superiors and reviewing our options. The challenge is how to maintain discipline while acknowledging that sometimes the spirit of service transcends the letter of the law." The room fell silent as the colonel opened the folder and reviewed its contents. James felt as though his entire future hung in the balance of the next few words. "Guardsman Mitchell, you will receive a formal reprimand for breach of protocol. This will remain in your permanent record as a reminder that military discipline cannot be abandoned, regardless of circumstances." James's heart sank, but he accepted the decision with stoic resolve. "However," the colonel continued, "you will also receive a commendation for exceptional service and for bringing honor to the Queen's Guard through your demonstration of compassion and human dignity." The contradiction was almost impossible to process. A reprimand and a commendation for the same action? Colonel Harrison noticed James's confusion and explained further. "Mitchell, leadership is often about balancing competing principles. We must maintain discipline while also recognizing that rigid adherence to rules without consideration for circumstances can sometimes conflict with our deeper values of service and compassion." The colonel stood once more and extended his hand to James. "You will continue your service with the Queen's Guard, but with a new understanding. Protocol exists to serve our mission, not the other way around. Your actions yesterday reminded all of us that our ultimate duty is to serve with honor, dignity, and humanity." As James shook his commanding officer's hand, he realized that his moment of compassion with Tommy had not ended his military career. It had redefined it. He had learned that true discipline sometimes meant knowing when to bend without breaking, and that the most important rules were often written not in manuals but in the human heart. Outside the colonel's office, Sergeant Major Williams walked beside him in comfortable silence. Finally, the older man spoke. "Mitchell, in 32 years of service, I've learned that the best soldiers are not those who blindly follow every order, but those who understand the difference between the spirit and the letter of the law. What you did yesterday was wrong according to protocol, but it was right according to everything else that matters." James nodded, understanding that he had been given not just a second chance, but a deeper appreciation for what it truly meant to serve with honor. 3 weeks had passed since the incident that changed everything, and James found himself back at his familiar post outside Windsor Castle. The morning routine was the same: the red tunic, the bearskin hat, the rigid posture. But something fundamental had shifted in how he approached his duty. The story of his encounter with Tommy had spread far beyond social media and news outlets. Letters arrived daily from around the world, thanking him for his compassion and sharing stories of how his simple act of kindness had inspired others. Children facing their own battles with illness had sent drawings of guards and pictures of themselves saluting. Parents wrote to express how his gesture had given them hope during their darkest moments. But the most meaningful correspondence had come from Tommy's family themselves. His mother had written a heartfelt letter explaining that Tommy had been fighting leukemia for 18 months, and that their trip to London had been planned as potentially his last vacation. The moment with James had become the highlight of not just their trip, but of Tommy's entire treatment journey. "He talks about you every day," the letter read. "He calls you his guard friend, and tells everyone who will listen about the soldier who shared his strength with him. You gave him something to hold on to when the treatments get difficult. You showed him that even when we have to stand still and be strong, we're not standing alone." The letter had arrived with a package containing a small photo. It showed Tommy in his hospital bed, wearing a miniature replica of the Queen's Guard uniform that his parents had found in a London gift shop. He was saluting the camera with a smile that radiated pure joy and determination. James kept the photo in his uniform pocket, a reminder of why compassion and protocol could coexist when guided by wisdom and genuine care for others. On this particular morning, As James took his position for the day's first watch, he noticed a familiar energy in the gathering crowd. Tourists were approaching his post with a different kind of reverence, many of them clearly aware of the story that had unfolded in this very spot weeks earlier. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, approached with her parents and stood quietly in front of James for several minutes. She didn't try to get his attention or make him react. Instead, she simply stood at her own version of attention, mimicking his posture as best she could. After a few minutes, she whispered to her mother, "I'm practicing being strong like the guard," and then gave James a small, respectful wave before moving on with her family. An elderly veteran paused during his morning walk and stood silently before James's post. The man's posture straightened into a military bearing that spoke of decades-old training and discipline. He offered a subtle nod of respect, one soldier acknowledging another, before continuing on his way. These small interactions happened throughout the morning, each one reinforcing James's understanding that his role extended beyond the traditional boundaries of guard duty. He had become a symbol of something larger, the idea that strength and compassion were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of true service. Around midday, James noticed a commotion near the castle gates. A small crowd was gathering, and he could hear excited whispers spreading through the group of tourists. As his eyes scanned the scene while maintaining his rigid posture, he spotted something that made his heart skip a beat. A familiar wheelchair was making its way through the crowd, pushed by a man James recognized immediately. Tommy had returned to Windsor Castle, but he looked remarkably different from the frail boy James had met 3 weeks earlier. His color was better, his posture stronger, and most notably, his knit cap was gone, replaced by a thin covering of new hair that spoke of successful treatment and renewed health. Tommy's family approached James's post slowly, just as they had done before. But this time Tommy was not confined to his wheelchair. He walked beside it, his steps careful but determined, his hand resting on the armrest for support when needed. The transformation was remarkable. Where once there had been a desperately ill child, now there was a young boy clearly on the path to recovery. When they reached their familiar spot in front of James's position, Tommy looked up with the same serious expression he had worn during their first encounter. But now there was something else in his eyes, a strength and confidence that spoke of battles fought and won. The boy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. As he unfolded it, James could see it was the photo his mother had mentioned in her letter, a picture of Tommy in his miniature guard uniform, taken during one of his treatment sessions. But now Tommy held it up for James to see, a proud smile spreading across his face. "I brought this to show you," Tommy said in a voice stronger than James remembered. "The nurses in the hospital said I was the bravest patient they'd ever seen. They said I stood guard over my own recovery just like you stand guard over the castle." James felt his chest tighten with emotion as he realized the profound impact their brief encounter had created. This child had drawn strength from their shared moment and used it to fuel his fight against cancer. The simple act of acknowledgement and respect had become a source of courage that helped carry Tommy through his darkest hours. Tommy's mother stepped forward and spoke quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "We wanted to come back to thank you properly. Tommy's latest scans show he's in complete remission. The doctors say his attitude and determination played a huge role in his recovery. He told them he had promised a guard that he would be strong, and he wasn't going to break that promise." The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing they were witnessing something special. Many people held phones recording the reunion, but there was a respectful hush that seemed to acknowledge the sacred nature of the moment. Tommy looked directly at James and executed a perfect military salute, clearly practiced and improved since their last meeting. "Thank you for teaching me how to be strong," he said with the solemnity of a soldier addressing a superior officer. "I kept my promise. I stood guard over myself until I got better." Without breaking protocol or his rigid posture, James managed to convey his pride and joy through the barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement that only Tommy would notice. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the connection that had formed between them and the mutual respect they shared. Tommy's Father approached and placed a small wrapped package at the base of James's post. "This is from Tommy," he explained. "He wanted to give you something to remember him by, the way you gave him a memory that helped him through his treatment." As the family prepared to leave, Tommy took one last long look at James. "I'm going to be a soldier someday," he announced with complete conviction. "And when I am, I'm going to remember that being strong isn't just about following rules. It's about caring for people and knowing when to show them that someone sees their courage." The wisdom in those words, spoken by a 7-year-old who had faced death and emerged victorious, struck James with profound force. This child had not only learned from their encounter, he had understood its deeper meaning better than many adults ever could. As Tommy and his family disappeared into the crowd, James remained at his post, carrying with him the knowledge that his moment of compassion had created ripples far beyond anything he could have imagined. The small package at his feet contained a hand-drawn picture from Tommy, a crayon illustration of 2 figures standing side by side, one tall and one small, both at attention, both strong, both watching over each other. Years later, when James would tell this story to new recruits joining the Queen's Guard, he would always end with the same lesson Tommy had taught him. True service means understanding that strength and compassion are not opposing forces, but 2 sides of the same coin. Sometimes the most important duty a soldier can perform is to recognize the courage in others and acknowledge it with simple human kindness. The photo Tommy had shown him that day remained in James's pocket throughout the rest of his service, a reminder that the impact of a single moment of compassion can resonate through a lifetime, giving strength to those who need it most, and teaching us all what it truly means to stand guard over what matters in this world.